we have Beth Balucos, a PhD student in Romance Studies from Cornell University. And she's presenting Queer Mexican National Identity, Trans Rhetoric, and Carmen Bulosa's
Duerme?
Duerme.
There you go. That was good. Thanks. So this talk is a portion of a chapter of my dissertation, which obviously it's very hard to condense into 15 minutes. So I feel as if a lot's going to be lost, but if you have questions about sort of other elements that I'm talking about, please feel free to ask. And my dissertation in general is on non-religious spirituality and the relationship between sort of the sacred and gender and sexuality in Latin America, specifically mostly in Cuba and Mexico. So I just wanted to say a bit about the author and the novel before I sort of delve into the argument. Carmen Bulosa was born in Mexico City, but has recently made Brooklyn, New York her home. She is one of the most important living Mexican novelists, but has also published numerous plays and poetry. The novel I'll be talking about today was published in 1994, and it's far sort of from being her most popular novel, but it's received a lot of critical attention because of these sort of queer elements in the narrative. The story takes place after the time of the conquest during the early colonial period in what is now Mexico. The protagonist, Claire, arrives in the New World as a pirate. And Carmen Bulosa has a lot of pirate novels about the conquest. And Claire identifies as male, and although he is born in France, throughout the course of the novel, Claire psychologically and corporally integrates indigenous aspects into his identity. And just briefly about pronouns that I'll be using. Essentially, I'm just going to mirror what happens in the novel, and so it goes mostly sentence per sentence in terms of gendered pronouns. So as different situations force Claire to go back and forth from male to female, French to Mexica, and oligarch to servant, we note how Bulosa complicates the borders between self and other. It is precisely this gendered other who becomes the symbol of the Mexico that is to be born from the conquest. No longer the Inca Garcilaso mestizo archetype of the nation, and briefly, Garcilaso is a writer and a poet during the colonial empire in Peru, and so he becomes a sort of symbol of what is the blending of these cultures, but he is in no way other in terms of his class. He's a noble, he comes from a noble family, or clearly his gender. He's set up to sort of be a prince if the conquest didn't happen. So whereas here with Bulosa's novel, we have a queering of race, class, and gender. There has been a lot of scholarly interest in Mexican national identity and how that relates to an understanding and a connection to the past. This paper sets out to demonstrate that Bulosa provides a unique vision of how Mexican history and a national identity based on that history can be understood in both spiritual and queer terms. I place Bulosa's novel in opposition to what has become known as magical realism and the Mexicanismo movement, which romantically glorified an indigenous past for political purposes. This talk will serve to explain Bulosa's philosophical project via the exploration of a potential Mexican cosmology and spirituality fixed upon an artistic or literary understanding of a queered Mexican history of the conquest. So I'll begin with sort of the element of treating it as magical, which has happened a lot in recent criticism. So in his article on Bulosa's seventh novel, Duerme, Cesar Rodriguez claims that the indigenous characters have, quote, magical knowledge. All translations throughout are mine, and positions this novel somewhere between magical realism and testimonial novels. Paula Madrid similarly notes the magical powers, quote, of the ancestors in the novel. The treatment of Duerme as both magical and spiritual within the same argument by Seidel demonstrates the general difficulty that this novel has presented scholars. Seidel, in an otherwise highly meticulous study of the book, which is about 600 pages long, the novel itself is about 120 pages, claims that the water in the novel possesses magical aspects, but later qualifies that by calling the water sacred. Tomás Granados Salinas' attempt to categorize the novel places it in a genre of Mexican literature with a particular political agenda, and this is Mexicanismo. And I quote from an article. Bulosa was unable to avoid the cliche, or she sought it out, that the character with the warm hands, and this is the main indigenous character in the novel, becomes a symbol of a confused pre-Hispanic heritage latent in the title of the novel. With this mystical and mythical element, the novelist seeks to inscribe herself in Antonio Velázquez Piña's school of nationalism, whose books announce the coming of the authentic Mexicans, direct descendants of a pre-Columbian splendor, end quote. While Granados Salinas correctly observes that a buried pre-Hispanic history rests beneath the surface of what it is to be Mexican in this novel, he wrongly incorporates this text into the movement of Mexicanismo and its literary subgenre. Which actually reached its height sort of around the publication of this novel. And sort of now that we have some distance from that political movement, we can revisit this generic classification of the novel. So Duarteme's project diverts from the ambitions of Mexicanismo in various ways. First, the text does not ask for a reinterpretation of past rituals the way that Mexicanismo does. The message of this text is not dogmatic in the sense that it promotes the reenactment of the rituals, but Buyosa challenges readers to relive and rethink this history through the literary experience. Second, Duarteme does not call for the reinstatement of pre-Columbian civilization in the empirical sense, a thought that seems at once comical and depressing. But it suggests a reevaluation of how some indigenous concepts persist in Mexico and how this in turn extends an autonomous spiritual orientation. Third, this novel paints neither a completely positive or negative picture of the pre-Hispanic past. Mexicanismo encourages a type of neo-indigenous romanticism that has no place in the text at hand. With Mexicanismo's desire to exalt lo indio, Mexicanistas must, quote, get rid of everything Western, end quote, which for them means the eradication of rationalism. Quite obviously, the act of studying the pre-Hispanic past as completely non-rational necessitated some serious unpacking by this movement for the obvious colonialist perspective it presupposed. In stark opposition to magical realism and Mexicanismo, Buyosa, for her part, has said that, quote, the market joyfully promotes third world writers as long as they reinforce the idea that South American nations are unintelligent but full of magic and fantasy, end quote. When we deem something magical, it connotes a certain judgment on the part of the critic and might problematically imply that this text somehow constitutes magical realism. Buyosa's comment highlights the need for caution when selecting terms. We risk a colonialist reading of Duarteme if we insist that it has these magical elements, since magic has often been associated with that which is non-Western. To consider a text magical serves to dismiss its importance, and we note how in that quote she links unintelligent and magical together. Rather than magical, we can better understand the phenomena in the novel if treated as events that allow for transcendence to a consciousness beyond our normal existence and the ability to rationally analyze the experience afterwards. Though other Buyosa novels certainly propose approaches to spirituality, it is in Duarteme that Buyosa most fully enters into the contemporary debates on gender and sexuality in relation to an understanding of the sacred. In Duarteme, the binary classification of Claire's spiritual experiences proves impossible and leads us to an exploration of how Buyosa counteracts the way gender and erotic metaphors traditionally function in Christian bridal mysticism. Although Buyosa disturbs these conventional metaphors, she maintains the mystical path of purgation, illumination, and transcendence. Buyosa emphasizes the function of ecstasy in the state before illumination, and therefore the text engages in the debate surrounding the role of experience in this process towards transcendence. I argue that a sense of touch, directed by issues of gender and sexuality, proves a necessary tool for the attainment of the affective ecstasy that Claire experiences while on a mystical journey. And this is where I sort of condense a great deal from the dissertation chapter, because in the full chapter, I explore sort of the connection between the sacred, religion, gender, sexuality, and ritual. The spiritual proposal in the novel negates traditional Christian concepts and problematizes this tradition by putting it into dialogue with Greek mythology and Aztec cosmology. Issues of gender, ethnicity, and sexuality shape the trajectory of the spiritual path as manifold situations, at once logistical and spiritual, force Claire to go back and forth from one identity to another. I chart Claire's amorous connections in the full chapter to explore how these situations relate to a growing sense of self-awareness. For Claire, desire not only develops in the erotic sense, but also concerns other gender and race issues, as our protagonist identifies as male, and a new connection to an indigenous identity expands through his ecstatic and ultimately unifying experiences.